Hi guys, welcome back. I've got another security stories for you. This one is on the more serious side, and just as a pre-warning, I'm going to be talking about the care system in the UK, the care of young people in the UK. So if that's a subject that could trigger you or upset you, be warned, I'm going to be talking in detail about the things that I saw within that system and some of the issues I think it faces, and it could be upsetting for some people. So I apologise for that, and I strongly suggest you do not watch this if you're upset by this kind of thing. So during my younger years, probably about 15 years ago now, I was working in the daytime in the care system as well as in the evening doing security. And there was a crossover there because it was kind of the more extreme side of the care system. It was looking after young people that were either about to go into secure care or they were coming out of secure care. So it was kind of a middle of the road between secure care for those young people. And I was approached by someone that I knew who worked in that environment, and they said to me, you have all the criteria that would make you ideal for this kind of job. We need someone that's pretty robust, that can deal with situations that are confrontational and difficult, but also has enough of an empathy and an understanding to be a kind of useful role model for these young people. So I thought, sure, I'll give it a go. And I started working in this system. Now, it was all new to me, and I would also mention, although there's been some small changes to the system, I do still know people that work in it. Not that much has changed. So a lot of the things that I experienced are still going on today. And I expect people in the comments that work in this system will be able to back some of this up. So for those of you who don't realise this, most of the young people in the UK are not cared for in great big Victorian style care homes. It used to be Borstals were the thing where you had these huge government run facilities that may have lots and lots of kids in them, almost like a young people's prison in a sense. And that was obviously one of the reasons that those things were eradicated, because they were horrible, tough institutions, often run by quite authoritarian, unpleasant people. There are many horror stories stemming back to those. So the care system needed an overhaul. What happened was it went into private hands, and the care system itself changed. A lot of the care homes in private hands didn't want to use the model of having this one big place that had lots and lots of kids in it because of the previous bad press, because of the liabilities involved, the difficulties in running such a large place like that. So they went over to using basically private homes that they would rent or buy, and then they would use those homes to look after one or maybe two or three kids in each home and run them in a criteria that was basically mimicking what would be a nuclear family. You would generally have a male carer, a female carer. They would do a 24-hour shift, and then you would have a young person in that care, or maybe more, depending on the severity of the young people's needs. So the young people that I looked after all had different needs, but they had mainly come from quite abusive backgrounds, and this is where it got quite upsetting, because many of them had suffered extensive physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and they were then stuck in the care system. Many of them had parents that were drug addicted, alcohol addicted, or were just plain abusive, and the children couldn't stay with those parents anymore, so they would be moved into the care system from there. Often the children had an extensive criminal history, and you might think, oh, these are naughty kids, but then you add that up to the history that they had with their families, and it was kind of no surprise that they had turned to crime, because really some of them didn't have many options. If you're that age, you can't go and get a job to put food in your mouth if your parents aren't taking responsibility for you and supplying you with the things you need. You're probably going to go and get it from other sources. And they weren't just stealing to eat. These kids were also looking for a family, looking for someone to look after them, so they would seek whoever was around. And of course there are many predatory groups of people waiting around for vulnerable children like that will happily take them in and pose as friends or helpers or additional family members, when actually they're utilising them for their own twisted benefit. So a lot of these kids had come from very, very unpleasant backgrounds. They'd also gone on to do some very unpleasant things, many of them to their peers, other people, older people, all kinds of things, whether it be breaking into people's houses, stealing cars. I think we had one lad that had stolen like 130 different motor vehicles. Their age ranged from generally about 8 or 9 years old through to like 16 years old. Once they become 16, they then go into a different format of care. The government surrenders the responsibility of taking full-time care of them, and they go into a sort of semi-supported environment where they basically get a house rented to them, and then they have care workers that can dip in and out and come in and out and visit them when they need them. So on the face of it, it sounds like it could work. You know, you've got this private house where you have a mother and a father figure that are the carers for 24 hours, and then you have this child in the house, and you would think, hey, the kid probably is very happy to be in that situation. Well, there's quite a lot of issues around the whole care process. And some of that stems from the bureaucracy and the health and safety policies that are in place. And I'll go into more detail on that. So when you first start working in those places, you're given an extensive list of things that you can and can't do. Obviously, it's a place where it would be very attractive for child abusers to want to work, because then they would have access to the children. You know, they have free access to vulnerable children. So firstly, you have to go through a screening process to make sure you haven't committed any sorts of crimes like that, you're a person of good standing, etc. Once you've passed that, you can then go into the care system as a worker. Now, the extensive kind of regulatory part of it is all kinds of things that you're expected to do, but many of those things work in opposition to each other. So you're supposed to create a homely situation where the child feels welcomed and even loved, you know, and looked after and secure. On the other side of that, you're not supposed to give any personal details away, but you are supposed to get details out of the child, you know, to fill out reports at the end of the day, find out what the child's been up to, who the child's associating with, if the child has made any declarations of illegal activities or things from the past that could be relevant, declarations of abuse, stuff like that. So they're expecting the child to completely open up to the carer, but the carer is not going to reciprocate that. And that's part of human nature. You know, if we want to share personal information with one another, it's usually a two-way street, right? Especially if you're maybe adverse to trusting people and you're not sure whether you want to share that or not. You're very unlikely to open up to someone that's a completely closed book to you. That's just not going to happen. Now, I understood the reason that those parameters were in place, because they didn't want carers to share lots and lots of personal info. That might lead to a relationship becoming too close, or it might even lead to the carer receiving some abuse and stuff at their own home or members of their family. But there has to be a happy medium in place in order to run what would be a sort of effective family unit. Otherwise, it just becomes a cold, unpleasant care system where the child is in care. He knows that the carers don't really care enough to give any of their personal information out. And it just feels like a very weird, robotic situation to be in. Now, the same thing goes with physical contact. It seems pretty obvious on face value that carers would be told, you know, you must not have physical contact with these children, apart from in very certain circumstances, which I'll get into in a minute. I've also got issues with that. But that is also very bizarre. If you have a mother and a father figure in a house, i.e. these two carers looking after a young person, and that young person goes through lots and lots of emotional roller coasters, trials and tribulations, as young people do, there will be times where they get extremely upset. Sometimes they will make, confessions about things, or, like I said, talk about something that's happened to them previously that they've never discussed before, and they will become very, very upset about it. Now, your obvious human reaction would be to reach out and give that person, put an arm around their shoulder, pat them, give them a hug, whatever it may be. That's a completely normal reaction, but you're not allowed to do those kind of things. So again, it seems very alien to the children to be sat there crying. And I've even been in situations myself where that's happened, and I've had these very small children reaching out and crying, you know, their eyes are absolutely red with tears, and they're like reaching out for a hug, because that's the natural reaction of a child in that situation. And you basically have to say, no, I can't, you know, I can't do that, which, if they were adults, they would completely understand why you couldn't do that, but they're not adults, they're children. So to them, you're just being an uncaring, cold, austere person that's there, and it's never really replicating the warmth that would be a loving, caring home for them to be in. The obvious solution to that is going to be to put them into foster homes, where foster parents do have more ability to act like normal parents. The trouble is, some of these kids have now become so old and have got so many problems attributed to them and such extensive criminal histories that no one really wants to foster those kids, and it's quite rare to see kids actually fostered at all in those situations. You tend to find it with kids that are a lot younger, but once they get to like 8, 9, 10, there's a limit to what people are prepared to do and take responsibility for. There are some fantastic people out there that do foster, but it's a bit like fostering animals in need. You know, there's never enough people to foster those animals or those kids. There's always a large amount that are kind of sat there waiting and hoping. Some of the kids we looked after had been fostered before, and the parents hadn't realised what they were getting into and had kind of given those kids back up. In fact, a few of the kids I looked after, that had happened to them multiple times, and unfortunately that really burns up their trust with adults, because they had come from a background where their mothers and fathers had mistreated them, so they weren't able to trust them. They had then gone into a care system that was cold and austere, like I've just described. Then they would get fostered. Whoa, this is going to be great. But then the foster parents couldn't handle some of their difficult behaviours and would give them back, so to speak. So now you had these kids that had pretty much learned that adults just in general weren't to be trusted. And when the kids were exhibiting bad behaviours, a lot of the time that was a cry for attention. You know, it was a way to get attention, and it was one of the only methods that they had learnt that actually worked. You know, if you had parents that didn't give a shit about you, never cared about you, and didn't do anything for you, and couldn't even be bothered to speak to you half the time, maybe the only way you could get any sort of reaction out of them was by acting up, and at least some reaction was better than no reaction at all. When they had these outbursts, you know, sometimes they could be extremely violent and difficult. They would obviously be abusive, swearing, spitting, all the kinds of things that you might expect from someone having a very angry outburst. But the physical violence would obviously be an issue, and you had a male and female carer in the house, generally both adults, but some of these kids were 14, 15, 16 years old, just coming up. They were physically powerful kids, and it was a very dangerous situation. So of course we had things in place that we would have to do to stop that situation occurring or getting any worse. And personally for me, the way that that was laid out was also very, very unpleasant. You would generally end up grabbing hold of these kids by the arms, and it would be like two carers would grab them by the arms, place them face down on the floor, and it was like a pin down situation where you would like put their head on a pillow or something soft so they couldn't bash themselves on the floor, but in effect you were holding them by the arms onto the floor on their fronts until they kind of struggled so much that they just absolutely ran out of energy and couldn't struggle anymore. They would then end up laying there crying their eyes out, and you couldn't hug them or anything afterwards because that was not appropriate. So you just had this weird situation where you've basically pinned a kid to the ground, held them there for ages, they've ended up crying their eyes out, and then you've kind of not done anything afterwards either and said, okay, you can get back up now, in a very robotic manner, which for someone who's been through a cycle of abuse must be absolutely horrific. Now this is where I had some disagreements with the system. I mean, I disagreed with the whole way it was done, to be frank, but I also really disagreed on this part because I don't think those kids needed to be pinned face down on the floor to deal with them. What they actually needed was like an authoritarian father type figure that would just grab them and kind of wrap them up in in a big bear hug basically and not let them free until they had stopped being dangerous. If you imagine back to being a child yourself and you'd had some kind of tantrum, your parents would have done a couple of different things. One might have been to smack your ass and kind of chastise you. Another one would have been to basically grab you. If you were in extreme distress, it would be more likely your parent would have grabbed you and kind of hugged you really close whilst you were struggling, and then you would have kind of given up struggling and it would turned into kind of a hug and some sympathy. And you weren't obviously able to do any of that, and that was really what was needed in many of those situations, that those kids needed reassurance, comfort, security. What they didn't need was two people that were trying to win their trust, grabbing hold of them and pinning them on the ground, because some of them might have come from circumstances where they got pinned down by adults and all kinds of deeply unpleasant things would have happened to them, and you're just replicating that same thing over again. So I thoroughly disagreed with that method. I didn't employ it personally, and I kind of used to break the rules in that regard, you know, so that didn't go down too well at all. But I just thought it was probably one of the worst things you could do to a child that was going through trauma at that point in time. Now, the other issues I had with the situation was that the whole place was set up very bureaucratically. So there would be like an amount of money for activities that you would get every day, and that would kind of build up in a kitty. And the kids were made aware of all this because they had social workers that would come and tell them. The social workers were always a massive pain in the bum because they were normally sort of really wishy-washy left-wing socialist types that really had no idea about the real world whatsoever and thought everything could be cured by, you know, buying a kid a cup of coffee and talking about some rainbow nonsense. And these kids were way beyond that. You know, they knew that these social workers were just suckers basically, and they would just utilize them and use them as per their will. And the social workers had the nicest of intentions, but they just weren't very robust people. You know, they needed to be a bit more street cred. You know, they needed to be people that the kids could look up to, and maybe like someone that had a life like that themselves and could understand some of the, you know, the kids' needs and behaviors, rather than understanding it from an academic perspective, because most of the social workers were more the academic side than the kind of grassroots side. The grassroots side tended to be more the carers, so there was a definite division. We often used to have situations where the social workers would turn up and undo a lot of the good work that we had already done by making promises that couldn't be kept, and, you know, saying everything was wonderful when it wasn't, and just filling the kids with kind of false hopes that they couldn't carry through, you know, and the kids would come to know that the social workers were basically bullshitters most of the time. So they had these financial things that would come in, and the kids got to know that, and they would basically want to spend that every day. And then they would have their food money, which they also had input in, so you would take them out shopping. And all this was supposed to be helping them to move into the real world when they got to 16, that they would be able to budget, handle their finances. But it was very unlike what you would have in a family. You know, if I am the father in a family, I might ask my kid what kinds of food they like and stuff, but basically I'm going to take control of the budget for that household. I'm going to decide what food we buy and don't buy. The kid's not going to really have any say in that, because that's what parents are there for. You know, if you let kids have full control of a food budget, you're going to end up with a bunch of donuts and Pop-Tarts and nothing really healthy to eat. And that's often what would happen in these places. You know, you would have just cupboards and fridges full of absolute crap, because the kid would have so much input into what the foods were every week, and the carers were kind of scared that if you didn't cooperate with the things the kid wanted as food, the kid would then kick off and you would have a big problem on your hands. So sometimes it was an issue that the carers themselves weren't robust enough to stand up to the child, and that's what these children needed. You know, a child feels secure when it's with adults that are looking after the child and are sticking firm with boundaries. You know, that you don't feel secure as a child if you're just with some random adult that just goes, yeah, whatever, we can do whatever. It sounds fun. You know, all children think they want that. I remember wanting to hang out with people that would do whatever, but actually that can be very dangerous, and it makes children feel very unsettled. They really need to have that safe home life, that if you remember back to being a kid, if you went out and did anything that was really dicey and dangerous, you would often think, oh, I've got to get back home, I want to get back home to that comfort of having those secure parents that would look after me and make sure no danger comes into the household. So I think we all have that deep down. So that was a really alien situation as well, and it wasn't normal to have like activity budgets every day. I understand again why that was input. It was very, very unrealistic. No family that I know has an activity budget every single day of the week. 70 to 80% of the time families don't have any activity budget whatsoever. The kids are just doing things at home, and they would limit what the kids were allowed to do at home. So you might think, well, they could play on a computer or they could play on a PlayStation, but those things were always massively limited, which is again something I know it's a difficult situation, but they are teenagers at the end of the day. Saying to a teenager you're allowed to play on a PlayStation for a half an hour or an hour, that's just not realistic in this day and age. And it wasn't even back then when I was doing it. That was all popular stuff back then. I know parents are happy to let their kids play for hours a day on those things, whether or not that's really good for them or really bad for them. But I would argue that if it's a kid in care and you've got a choice of them sitting in a warm, secure house and playing on a PlayStation and chatting to some people online versus absconding, disappearing for the night and then coming back the next day with a massive hangover, I would definitely opt for the computer route, and that was something that was always limited, mainly by the bureaucracy higher above us, that they would say, no, this is, these are the time limits on things like this. They had a very unrealistic expectation of what you could do for £6. And that £6, by the way, would be the child and 2 carers to go and do an activity. So even in that period, even 20 years ago, God knows what activities they would expect you to do. I mean, the best thing we could come up with was like going down to the penny arcade, going for walks, stuff like that. Sometimes we'd be able to, save the activity money up for multiple days and then do a bit more of a fun activity at the end of the week. The kids also had a clothing allowance, but all these allowances they knew about, and the adults didn't really take a huge amount of responsibility in how that was spent. It was mainly down to the kid, like what clothes they got, which again, the kids would often pick completely inappropriate stuff. Things that wouldn't really set them up for like being warm in the winter or whatever it was. They would end up buying some ridiculous high heels if it was a girl, or if it was a boy they would buy a pair of football boots that they didn't need because they already had 3 pairs. Whatever it was, it was bad ideas to let the kids have that much control over the budgets of what was going on. Now, I mentioned absconding. That was a huge part of the care situation, and it put a lot of pressure on the police as well. And I know this still goes on to this day, that the kids would be either not allowed out to start with, or once they gained a little bit of trust and responsibility, they would start being allowed out for quite short periods of time. I understand why that happened, because there's a liability aspect there, but again, it's unrealistic. Teenagers want to be out meeting other teenagers, and hopefully they're going to meet some nice teenagers which are going to sort of rub off on them, and they're going to form some nice friendship groups, which would definitely be a way forward. There was, of course, always an inclination for a lot of these kids that come from abusive backgrounds to not find nice friendship groups and to fall into the hands of predatory groups, which is why it was a very limited thing of allowing them to go out for certain periods of time. But of course, being teenagers, they would just disappear and they wouldn't come back. It was pretty simple. They didn't feel any parental sort of tie with us. We were just carers. They would often remind us of that. Hey, you're just a carer, you get paid, that's why you're here. And they would disappear off, not come back, and then they would sort of turn up bedraggled looking the next day. Often they would fall into the hands of adults that were obviously after them for a variety of criminal means, whether it was abusing them, whether it was getting them to run drugs around. All these different things were going on. One of the frustrating parts of that was that the police would get so annoyed about the amount of missing persons calls that these care homes put through to them, that generally speaking, they were just taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt. The police would kind of turn up because they had to. they would not be too happy about it, which I don't blame them for, because this would be like multiple times a week often in these care homes. The police would be called about a missing person. Then of course the kid would turn up again the next day and everything would be fine, except, you know, where had the kid been, who had the kid been with. When we got reports that the kid had been in very unpleasant situations with adults, I would always give those reports into the police. The police rarely acted on them. You know, I found that frustrating, that in my mind there were people that were probably paedophiles out there, that we had some evidence that these paedophiles were kind of preying on kids in care homes, and yet the police weren't particularly interested in pressing that matter. I think partly because the kids that we were looking after were such unreliable witnesses, and they were prone to sometimes making stuff up, but sometimes not. You know, sometimes it was actually happening, and you can't just dismiss everything because it might not be true, because otherwise you're going to miss out on a whole bunch of dangerous criminals operating out there, and you're going to fail to stop them, which was exactly what was happening. The system also facilitated completely inappropriate adults having access to these kids. I remember one kid in particular, her stepfather used to turn up and pick her up, and there was a whole document of like instances where the kid had made allegations about the stepfather abusing her in various different ways, but then had always dropped those allegations right at the last minute. You know, when the guy was going to be charged or whatever it was, the allegations were dropped. The kid would turn around and say, no, I made it all up, it wasn't true. Then would continue having a relationship with this person. It was pretty clear to me that when this kid got back, something very untoward had been happening. I obviously filed all the reports to the right people, but there was nothing the system could do about it. So this guy would turn up and we would literally have to hand this girl over to a guy who I was 99% sure was going to abuse this kid, but lawfully he had the right to come and collect her, and I tried my best to prevent that from happening lawfully as well. Couldn't do anything about that. The only way I could have done it would have been to actually physically prevent him from coming in, but then he would have just called the police and I would have been arrested and probably lost my job as well. So I couldn't really do anything against what was clearly failures in the system to pick this stuff up. You know, if there's like 10 reports that an adult's been doing something and then it's dropped every time at the last minute, we know this from domestic violence, that it's very common for victims to drop things because they're stuck in this sort of Stockholm syndrome situation where they feel a bond to the person that's abusing them, because that might be a close family member, for example. It might be the only adult in their lives that has shown them any sort of love whatsoever, despite the fact it's completely toxic and has some abusive elements to it. So for that reason, they might find it better to just bury the abuse and continue with a toxic relationship. But we should have been taking responsibility for that, and the government should take responsibility for that as well, and the bureaucrats at the top end of the care system should take responsibility for that. Most of the kids I saw coming through that system were extremely damaged. The system didn't help them. They continued to become more damaged. And I honestly don't believe that we did much good for them. You know, as much as all the care staff were generally good people and they tried their hardest, I really don't think those kids had huge benefits. The best you could say was that we kind of made a 50% effort. Maybe we kept them 50% safer than they would have been without the care system, and you just left them in a room living together. But, you know, it didn't stop them doing any of the negative behaviours, because you couldn't keep them under lock and key. They were in this weird halfway house, this limbo place where they didn't warrant a secure unit, so you couldn't lock them in to keep them safe. And at the same time, you know, if you put them in a normal house where you also couldn't lock them in to keep them safe, because that would be false imprisonment basically, then they would be just running off and doing whatever they wanted anyway, and then it was putting huge pressure on like local resources such as the police or the emergency services. While I was working there, I do remember one really weird incident that springs to mind, and this actually had nothing to do with the kid. We had a house in a town, and it was on the side of some woods and fields, and we were looking after a young boy at the time. He was about 14, good lad actually, you know, one of the the nicer lads that I ended up looking after. He had a pretty horrific upbringing, but he was a really nice lad, and he used to like to go out in the evening and play like tag and stuff like that in the fields, and he would always want to play like hide and seek and stuff in the woods. Me and the other carer, and sometimes a couple of the local kids would be around and would play as well. So we went over and played, and the female carer had walked off, you know, to hide or to look or whatever it was, I can't quite remember, but came running back, and she said, "There's a weird guy hiding behind a tree round there." So I said, well, that doesn't sound good, because it's dark, you know, it's like 8 o'clock at night, and it's getting winter time sort of thing in the UK, so it's getting pretty dark. The kid's with us at this point, and I said, will you stay with the kid? I'm going to run off and see why this guy's hiding behind a tree, because it seems pretty unusual for a grown man to be doing that if he's not playing with us lot. Maybe he's playing with his own kid. So I walk round there, and sure enough, a guy springs out from behind a tree, and I could see by his face, he was in his like 40s, I could tell by his face he was not expecting it to be me. I think he thought it would be this woman again, and then he completely turned around and started sprinting off. I actually watched him sprint straight across a field, and he leapt quite a wide dike there, a stream, and again I thought unusual for a 40-something-year-old man to see me sprint at full speed across this field, jump over a stream, and then disappear into the night. So we did the right thing and rang the police and just said, look, this is, you know, I don't know if this is important, but this is what we saw. It seems like it's a bit out of the ordinary. Thought you might want to know for your intelligence kind of thing in case there's a creepy man in the area. Well, about 20 minutes later, armed police turn up, and there's literally about 20 coppers there, including coppers with guns. And I said, wow, this is a big response to this phone call. What's going on? And they took all the information off us about this guy. We'd given some information over the phone, but we then gave them some more information about what he looked like, all that kind of thing. And it turned out that they pretty much 100% sure that this guy was a rapist who was operating in the area, and he had been pretty prolific. He had committed quite a lot of rapes in the area, was uncaught obviously, and what he had done fitted the MO of the rapist, and of course the description fitted the MO as well. That was very freaky indeed, and I do believe that that guy never went on to be caught, so we might have had a glimpse of someone that had committed some horrendous crimes and actually never ended up getting caught for it. That was probably one of the stranger encounters that I had during my time working in care, but as I said, it had nothing to do with the care system in general. That was just one of the things we did in the evening. The reason I left the care system, and again this is one of my complaints about the privatised care system, is private care companies exist because they make money. You know, they're not run by really nice, kind individuals that are just doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. You know, that's foster parents. Foster parents are generally doing that because they're kind and nice. They don't tend to make a lot of money out of what they're doing. They get paid you know, to subsidise what they're doing as foster parents, but really it doesn't, you know, it doesn't equal what they're probably paying out, so they're not doing it really for financial means. Private companies are running care homes because they want to make money, just the same as G4S runs prisons. It doesn't run prisons because it really cares about prisoners or crime or anything like that. It runs them to make money. That's one of the reasons it's also giving up all the prisons, or trying to give them up, because it's not making enough money. So these care homes were run on pretty tight budgets, and one of the difficult parts about that was staff pay. The staff pay was incredibly bad, like very, very poor indeed. So for a high stress job where you would be sworn at, spat at, have all these kind of high risk situations, dealing with runaways and all this kind of thing, sometimes dealing with arsonists, like the most crazy situations you can possibly think about. I think I had a TV thrown at my head at one point, I remember. I had a kid try and set fire to a house, so all kinds of bizarre stuff would happen. And at the time I was getting like £7.50 an hour. Obviously that's gone up now because of minimum wage. I guarantee you that carers in that situation will still not be getting good pay. It will be just above minimum wage if anything. And there was really no room for promotion. You know, if you got really good, you could kind of go one tier up to be like a care manager and manage a team. but even that was pretty poor pay. So there was no facility to really make it in that world. If you're at the lower levels, the only way you could make it would be to run your own care home, and then you would just be replicating the same thing of paying your staff pretty crap wages so you could bleed as much profit out of it as possible. Personally, I don't think it's good that care is privatised like that, you know, because children suffering and the problems that they've had, and children that from abusive backgrounds, shouldn't be a vehicle by which private companies make profit. And, you know, cutting corners on the care of that child or the quality of the staff shouldn't be a vehicle by which the company puts more money into its own pockets. That's just my personal opinion. I don't have a perfect solution for that. I think I would like to see our taxes spent on care homes in the UK rather than maybe sent overseas, or for people that are turning up here and wanting our help. I think we have a lot of things that we could help here that are really, really needy, like the care system, and I would argue that I would take care of those before I started taking care of people that just randomly turned up on boats, many of which don't actually require help. They've just decided that we're a better economical option for them. Thanks for watching. I hope that was somewhat enlightening about the care system and young people today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you currently work in the system, if you have worked in it, or if you haven't and it's opened your eyes a little bit and you've got some comments to make. Would love to hear them down below. Sorry about the difficult and disturbing subject matter. I hope that was all right with everyone, but I think this is an important subject that needs and warrants discussion. Take care. I'll catch you all next time.